איזה מוזר. אדוארד, איזה תמונה אתה רואה כרגע על המסך?
התמונה הכפולה.
כי כשאני מקליטה ביוטיוב, משום מה הוא לא נותן לי לראות את זה. זה מוזר.
לא יראו את זה, לא נורא.
רגע, אני אנסה לראות מה עושים.
אפשר להכין לך תה?
מה אתה רואה עכשיו, אדוארד?
מה אני רואה? אותו דבר.
אותו דבר. או, עכשיו אני מתחילה לראות את זה, אוקיי. איך היה שבוע שעבר, אדוארד?
היה בסדר, אבל האם זה הוקלט כמו שצריך?
כן, כן, זה הוקלט כמו שצריך, ממש בסדר.
יופי, זה מה שרציתי לדעת. אוקיי. כן, תראו טוב, אני אגיד כמו כל השיעורים.
זה שאתה לא עולה לירושלים זה כבר בסדר.
זה שמה?
זה שאתה איתנו ולא עולה היום לירושלים.
לא, הייתי עולה לירושלים, אבל הייתי חולה אתמול ושלשום.
אוי, הכל בסדר?
אני עדיין מרגיש קצת עייף, אז בהתייעצות.
לא קורונה.
לא, עשיתי שתי בדיקות, אחת היום ואחת אתמול, שתיהן יצאו שליליות, ולכן זה לא. יכול להיות שזו הייתה מכת חום, אבל או וירוס אחר.
אוקיי, אז תשמור על עצמך, תרגיש טוב.
אבל מחר, אם אני מרגיש בסדר, אז אין אפס. אין אפס.
אין אפס.
תהיה בריא.
אני אהיה בירושלים.
זה עכשיו מגיע מכל מיני מקומות מצחיקים.
זה מגיע, תראי, מה שפוגע הכי הרבה בבריאות של כולנו, אני חושב שזה לא וירוסים.
כן, בהחלט. אני רק רוצה רגע לנצל את הזמן עד שגשם הרגע מצטרפת אלינו. יש איזושהי הקלטה אחת שנשאלתי לגביה, אני אומרת את זה רגע בעברית, שפשוט היא לא הצליחה. I was asking about recording from this last month, from August, and there is one recording that I don't know why, but maybe I done something wrong and it's deleted. So I'm looking for a backup if I can find. So I will let you know all of the people that ask me about it. The next thing is about Google Drive. I make there some changes. So there is files that you can find there, all the material, not from the YouTube, but the writing material like PDF and other things that Geshe prepare for the course. So you can go there and find it very easy now. It's not one big list, it's by files. I will put it here. Just one moment. In the chat, so everyone can see it and go there, and it's open for everyone. Hi, Geshe.
Hi.
I just explained that there was one recording from August that I think that I made a mistake and delete it. So I'm looking for a backup. Maybe I can find it. And that I go over all the material that you sent me and put them on Google Drive by files, that it will be easier for other people to find what they want.
Okay, great. Sounds good.
All the things that you prepare.
Okay.
So
great.
I will make you co-host. Just remove pin. Just one moment, please.
Sure.
Yeah, it's okay.
Great, thank you. Okay, let's start. Just focusing on the breath. Then visualize in the space in front of you your lama or your lamas rising in the form of Buddha Shakyamuni, whose appearance is radiant and inspiring. With all these features being manifestations of his enlightened qualities. In particular, great compassion and wisdom. And then visualize that you're surrounded by each and every sentient being. Quietly seated around you, appearing as human. With those you have a hard time with, you dislike and try to avoid, right in front of you. And then let's think that so far the reason for all our problems, our unwanted experiences, has been our self-grasping and our self-centeredness. We've deprived ourselves of true and lasting happiness by ignoring the welfare of all sentient beings. So let's switch this focus from ourselves onto all sentient beings. Generating affectionate love in the form of sincere care and affection. Putting not ourselves, but all sentient beings in the center of our attention. And then focusing on all the unwanted experiences sentient beings have and the causes of these experiences. Generate great compassion, that is a deep sense of affection that wishes for all sentient beings to be free from suffering, from these unwanted experiences and their causes, and wishes to protect them from those, wishes to take personal responsibility to help sentient beings overcome their sufferings and their causes. With this aspiration then growing stronger and giving way to the altruistic attitude, completely determined to do whatever is needed, dedicating our lives towards helping sentient beings to overcome their sufferings and that which causes them. And since the best way to accomplish that is to attain the enlightened state of a Buddha, let's once again generate bodhicitta, a mind that is conjoined with the aspiration to attain the enlightened state of a Buddha for the welfare of each and every sentient being. Which is also our motivation for continuing to study the fundamental wisdom. So then, with this in mind, focusing on the Buddha as our object of refuge and all sentient beings, let's recite the prayer. I go for refuge until I'm enlightened, to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly. By the accumulation of merits of practicing generosity and so forth, may I become a Buddha to benefit all sentient beings. I go for refuge until I'm enlightened, to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly. By the accumulation of merits of practicing generosity and so forth, may I become a Buddha to benefit all sentient beings. I go for refuge until I'm enlightened, to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly. By the accumulation of merits of practicing generosity and so forth, may I become a Buddha to benefit all sentient beings. Okay, then we'll start with the Lamrim. Yep. All right. Now we're still with the practices common to the person of middling spiritual capacity. Of course, this is not saying that we are aiming for only self-liberation. That's why it's called the practices that are common of a person who aims only for self-liberation. But to generate a stable basis, it's important to go through these practices as part of our Lamrim practice. And so what we've learned so far is, of course, the different types of suffering. So we've had the chance to go through them, to reflect on them, possibly to meditate on them. And then, of course, we went through the causes, what caused those sufferings, the different root afflictions, which, of course, the misperception or the root misperception, self-grasping, is the main cause. We're aware of that, but unfortunately, this root misperception, well, it gives rise to self-centeredness, with those two being the main causes, but then, of course, to many other different afflictions, which then in turn are responsible for generating karma. That is volitional actions of body, speech, and mind. So we've gone through all these and have some sense of, therefore, the origin of suffering, having discussed or having gone through the causes. And now, well, lastly, before we continue with the last two truths, this explanation follows how, based on karma and afflictions, or afflictions and karma, we then, well, are born and die. Well, first die. I mean, it's the order here that we die first, having taken a life now, and after that we're reborn. There's a state in between, the pardo state in between, and then thereafter we're reborn. So to remind us of that, we've spoken about death in some detail last week. I guess that's sufficient, but of course sufficient not in the sense that we shouldn't remember our death. So important to bring to mind the fact that, well, it seems we're going to live a long life, or we may even have this weird thought that's totally irrational, but somehow we never pay much attention to it. Well, I'm not going to die tomorrow because I'm so busy. I've got so much planned. So this sense, there's no time for death. But of course, if we think about it deeper, I mean, if we really reflect on especially death as it is described in the Lamrim, well, becomes obvious that death could hit us anytime. And that being the case, once we realize that, well, to ask ourselves, are we prepared or not? If I knew this was my last day, well, am I prepared? Am I ready? And so to live our lives, to make it a point to live our lives as if today was our last day, this is my last hour, etc. Which is totally in accordance with reality, because we never know. But the Lamrim doesn't just talk about that. So what happens when you die? And that is also, of course, part of the meditations, the different meditations that are offered or that are described in terms of our own death, going through this, the stages of our own death, to be prepared. I mean, to be vivid and aware when the actual moment of death is there. And of course, very important for us beginners to have a virtuous mind. So one way is to become more familiar with our own death, to go through the stages as they're described. So this is described in the clearest way in the tantric teachings, the different absorptions, how the minds grow subtler and subtler. So for those who possibly do some tantric practices, there are these meditations going through the death stages, but you don't need to do those. You could also do these meditations, go through the death stages, and there's plenty of literature on that, and meditate on it, not in the tantric context, but in the sutric context, and in that way get prepared, be ready for when the time comes, for when, well, this actually happens to us. And at that time, be aware, be mindful, and of course, generate a very virtuous mind. extremely virtuous mind to the best of our ability. But then also be aware that, well, it's like falling asleep. Death can be compared, it's the closest everyday kind of experience we have of death is falling asleep. And we're advised, of course, as part of our death preparation as well, to be extremely mindful when we fall asleep, to generate a virtuous mind. Of course, the more virtue we practice throughout the day, the more we take care of not getting angry and resentful or lessen our attachment, etc. Of course, we won't be able to completely get rid of these afflictions unless we totally eliminate them by realizing emptiness directly, but we can make a point in reducing them, reducing the habit, therefore, so that when they arise, we become mindful, we apply the antidotes and let them go until, of course, they occur again. But the point being, every day preparing for our own sleep, but of course, in the long term, preparing, or long term, who knows, short term, preparing for our own death. But then the Lamrim also explains that, well, after death, of course, it's not the end of everything, however depressing it may seem. And of course, we have to leave behind this body and everything that is associated with this body in terms of our family, our possessions, and so forth. So to also be aware of that, like, I have to let it go. I have to let it go one day, which makes it easier to deal with attachment. If I have to leave it behind, I don't know, whenever I die, may it be in a year or in a day, in 10 years, well, why am I so attached to it right now? Use it, of course, hopefully for the benefit of others, but then I'm also ready to let it go when necessary. Anyway, so to become aware of that, and then also know that with the end of this life, well, there's what's called the pardo, the in-between state. We don't have time to go through it in much detail, but we have to be aware that there is such a state, which can be compared to dreams, to a dream state. So we take on a very subtle body at that time. So the moment when death occurs, from a Buddhist point of view, what is death itself? Well, it's the moment when our consciousness and our present body separate. So dying describes this process of the mind slowly moving towards that state, moving towards, well, growing subtler. Our ordinary awakened state grows subtler. Now, not in preparation for sleep, but in preparation for death, which, as I just said, is that moment when the mind and the body separate, when the mind leaves the body. Of course, there's this very subtle mind that arises, or the mind basically grows so subtle that there's a moment when there's the clear light mind of death. And of course, for an advanced practitioner, this is an opportunity to hold this mind, to meditate on that mind, meditate ideally, or take the object of emptiness and meditate on this. But if we're not on that level, if we don't have that kind of ability of staying aware all through the mind growing subtler and then utilizing the subtle mind, well, it's just going to happen by itself. We won't be able to stop it and be reborn in the pardo state. So the pardo, this in-between state, that which caused this pardo is the karma that ripens just before our death, that starts to ripen just before our death. It is unnatural for us ordinary beings, as long as we haven't realized emptiness, what happens just before the moment of death occurs? Well, when the mind grows subtler and subtler, and here, like I said, unless we realize emptiness directly, we cannot control that. But there's going to be attachment. There's going to be grasping at the self, because there's a sense I'm disappearing because of that separation of mind and body. So that will trigger, that will lead to the ripening of a new karma, of existence in samsara, because that's what we're craving in that moment. But if together with that, we've also had a virtuous mind, then what's most likely to ripen is a positive kind of karma. And the pardo state that will arise before we are reborn, that is caused by that same karma. So there are different explanations on that pardo state, that in some texts it is described that this is settled, that this is, or set as in like there's nothing you can do about it. But for instance, Asanga talks about that not being the case, that it actually can be changed. So when a person dies, for instance, and we do certain prayer rituals and so forth for their benefit. So in Tibetan society, for instance, there's a lot of prayer that is done. So when that is done for that person, it is said that actually their karma can change. It can slightly change. Another ripe. I mean, it's not like someone else's karma ripens, but another of their karma may ripen, or there may be some change. How that exactly occurs is not really clearly explained, but there is some change, and we can benefit a person in that way. So to pray for them because of our karmic connection with them, or have certain prayers done for them. Anyway, of course, it doesn't really save the person, but it can benefit them. I mean, it doesn't, if their karma is really strong and their afflictions are really strong when they pass away, well, when their afflictions are very strong when they pass away, and therefore a strong negative karma ripens, there's very little we can do, but a little bit we can do. Anyway, so then the pardo is reached. We ourselves, we should think about this state in between, which is like a dream, compared to the dream. So we should not just stop at meditating on our own death, but also visualize that our mind, of course, continues on, driven, yes, by karma and afflictions, which unfortunately, although they're not in the nature of our mind right now, they control our experiences. But to really get a sense of that and do the visualization, do this meditation, our mind continuing for some time, 49 days, that's usually the time that's the time prescribed. Like that's the longest we may stay in that in-between state where we have a very subtle body. We can perceive other beings who are in a pardo that is caused by a similar karma in terms of projecting karma. We can quickly move from one place to the next because we have the subtle body, etc. So you'll find in the literature there's a lot of explanation on that. But whether we stay for those 49 days or we are reborn later, well, eventually we will be reborn. We'll be born again if we're fortunate as a human being, for instance. And then the description is that, and you can read it on in more detail. So I think it's Asanga's yogic levels that describes that process of when your mind, again, undergoing a death in the pardo, now is reborn, takes birth into our parents, into our mother's womb, driven by anger, driven by attachment. So those are the afflictions that arise in that moment when there's very little control. And of course, what happens is our mind perceives the parents, perceives the fertilized egg, although the parents being perceived is described as a vision. It doesn't mean that they're actually there, but there's still a vision of our future parents and of the fertilized egg, and the mind then, due to the karmic force, connects with that fertilized egg, and of course the rest we're aware of. Anyway, so to get a sense, this is going to happen to us. I mean, our mind continues. Our mind is the one thing that goes on, of course, with the karmic imprints, but mainly of our mind and body. Of course, it's the mind that continues on. We'll always be conscious. We may not remember, but even while we fall asleep, etc. So to really get a sense of that, this life is just one stage. It's not very long. We need to be prepared of what is to come. And the best way to do is to do this meditation, to not just intellectually go, yeah, right, but to generate a real sense of it in our meditation by visualizing these states. And then Lamrim beautifully explains all this, so it makes it much easier for us to go through these stages. So important to do this on so many levels. Okay, anyway, having said all that, I want to continue now with a text. Finally, it's taking some time. I haven't had the time to prepare new material yet because I have to prepare for the teachings in October, His Holiness's teachings, prepare the empowerment, and I'm almost done with it. So I've got more time now to continue with the material, but we still have quite a few pages left. Anyway, I did give you the outlines last time, but I found a mistake in the numbering. I sent it to Dalit today, finally. I totally forgot to send it to her earlier, and then today I remembered. I sent it to her, and after I sent it to her, of course, I found a mistake like half an hour before we started class. So this is nothing. I just, the numbering here, the numbering wasn't correct. So today after class, I'll send it to Dalit right away. This is just wrong. I mean, I was completely confused because I was like, where's 2A1? I looked for it and I couldn't find it until I realized, oh, I just messed up the numbering. In Tibetan, actually, there are no numbers. It just says the first one can be divided into another 3. And of those 2, the first of these 3, the first one can be divided into another 2 and so forth. I mean, it doesn't have the numbers, and maybe the numbers really are more confusing than helpful. But the best way, well, as part of our studies, we dealt with all these divisions was to just memorize it. And when you memorize it, it's right in your mind. You've got it right in front of you, and it's much easier to get a full sense of the text. Now, of course, I'm not asking you to memorize it. I'm just saying, for those who are interested in maybe something you want to do. Anyway, now, as I pointed out last time, still I haven't integrated these outlines, that is, these headings, into the text. I need to think about this a little bit, how to do it for it not to get too confusing. But what I want to say is, what I want to stress is that this text, of course, as we've heard, deals with dependent arising and understanding, especially of the emptiness of dependent arising. So dependent arising is empty of essential or inherent existence, as we've heard. And then as a part of presenting the emptiness of dependent arising, and of course the emptiness of other phenomena as well, but the emptiness of dependent arising is usually not stressed as much as just emptiness of the I and the body and so forth, because dependent arising is the reasoning. It's usually presented as the reasoning that proves or that establishes phenomena cannot exist the way they appear to us. But we shouldn't forget, of course, that dependent arising itself also lacks inherent existence. So that's stressed here. And as part of dependent arising lacking inherent existence, well, that takes us to selflessness, of course, or emptiness. Selflessness here being another term for emptiness. So the lack of so the emptiness of dependent arising is a type of emptiness. And we have 2 types of emptiness: emptiness of phenomena and emptiness of person. Now, dependent arising, or the emptiness of dependent arising, belongs to the category of the emptiness of phenomena. Of course, dependent arising is not a person. So therefore, it's part of the emptiness of phenomena. And now to present the emptiness of phenomena, in particular in this context of dependent arising, but of course also actually, well, of the two types of selflessness or emptiness of phenomena is described first in the context of dependent arising, but not to neglect, of course, also the emptiness of persons. That's important to set that for us as well. But what's interesting that the first chapter deals with or sets forth the emptiness of phenomena. So in that sense, well, the emptiness of dependent arising is an emptiness of phenomena. But not just that, it sets forth dependent arising as well. So it sets forth the emptiness of a particular type of dependent arising, which is dependence on causes and conditions. So of the 3 types of dependent arising, the easiest type is dependence. The easiest type of dependent arising is dependence on causes and conditions. And therefore, the first chapter deals with the emptiness of causes and conditions. And right now it deals mainly, well, not just right now, but it deals with causes, the lack of inherent existence of causes. That's the name of the chapter. But of course, also implied in that are effects, and we'll talk about that as well. Anyway, so therefore, the first chapter deals with the emptiness of dependent arising, in particular, dependence on causes and conditions, or emptiness of cause and effect. Okay, now we've learned a lot about arising so far. Don't need to go through those again, but to take us to verse 4 and 5. Now, right now, we're dealing with the refutation of the inherent existence of conditions. So the essence of conditions or inherent existence of conditions. It's that Tibetan word rangxin. Rangxin can mean essence or nature or inherence. So, and then if it's combined with existence, it becomes inherent existence. But essential existence works just as well, as if there were some essence. I mean, a conventional essence, yes, but some ultimate essence that makes a table and a chair a chair. And of course, that's denied. Anyway, so to refute the essence of conditions, of causes or of conditions, and here we deal with, or we talk about the lack of inherent existence of conditions in two ways. First of all, the lack of inherent existence in terms of that which arises, and the lack of inherent existence in terms of action or arising itself. Though I should stress it also deals with producing. So not just here in terms of the agency or that which arises. We've gone through this, or we're still going through this in some detail, but then later on it also talks about producing something. That's another action, that's another activity or function that is performed in the context of causes or conditions. All right. Anyway, having said that, so with regard to here looking at the agency or that which arises, in particular, so in verse 4, we talked about the refutation of the inherent existence of conditions on the ground that they facilitate the action of arising. So conditions and action of arising. Okay, so we talked about that. Now today we talk about the refutation of inherent existence on the ground of the arising of their result. Okay, so let's look at that. Here, these headings of the different outlines, as I mentioned before, it's a little bit confusing. It's almost easier to go through the material first and then look at the outlines, because first I'm not sure it becomes clear right away what this outline talks about. But anyway, let's see. Okay, now to continue with the text. This is now verse number 5. In response to the explanation given in verse 4, someone might argue. Now, what you'll notice is it's like there's always someone arguing, and then Nagarjuna answering, and someone else coming. But of course, this is first of all a reflection of the way to study the texts through debate, through an exchange with others, which is so helpful. Because our mind is just one mind, but getting all this input from other people. So now, of course, in the different institutions, let's take Nalanda, of course, classic Nalanda Monastic University, so many people came together and discussed and debated the Dharma. And those people who came together were not restricted to Buddhists. I mean, they were, imagine this incredible place, Nalanda. If you've ever been there, you can imagine it probably more vividly because you've seen at least the surrounding, although there's not much left of the university itself, except for some ruins. But the point is that there was this incredible place of learning that became well known, and a lot of people traveled there, and not just Buddhists. Well, of course, there were many Buddhist monks, but also lay people who followed the different Buddhist traditions. but also non-Buddhists who came together and discussed their own views with Buddhists. And that was so helpful. That was so helpful for those present, because it helped them to understand their view better, see the shortcomings in their assertions and so forth. That constant exchange. Now, Nagarjuna, being one of these Nalanda masters, he was also familiar with that kind of atmosphere of exchange, of intellectual exchange. Someone says this, so how am I going to react to this? And it's not about convincing anyone. It's just about sharing and understanding that two minds are better than one mind, in the sense of getting new ideas, even if the other person's view is not in accordance with reality, but we can always learn something from it. Anyway, so that's the style of writing here also reflects this. In particular, here, of course, Lama Tsongkhapa's commentary, which presents someone's assertion, someone this and that. So it's one way to look at this, but also our own mind is like that. I don't know whether some of you remember, years ago, His Holiness taught a text, which was very interesting. It was a text of the self-grasping mind having a conversation with wisdom, right? So you have two minds and they kind of have a conversation. So of course, you can imagine it's like about the self-grasping mind promoting inherent existence, whereas wisdom promoting the lack of inherent existence. Now this dialogue going on, but actually we have that internal, I'm not saying we have an internal dialogue between wisdom and self-grasping in that literal sense, but our own mind works in that way. There are those minds that are driven by attachment. Oh, I really want this. Should I not do this? And then there are other minds that go, oh, well, but we just learned in class, attachment is just it's just like taking salt and expecting to not be thirsty. We'd be even thirstier than before. So drinking salt water, etc. So in that way, oh, I shouldn't do this because my attachment is just going to get stronger. So this internal dialogue that we often had, it's also reflected in here. So on one hand, I might think, well, but it appears to be so solid, this I. Well, they tell me it doesn't exist inherently, but it feels so strongly to be there. I'm so used to it. And then this other mind going, well, yeah, but there's all this reasoning that refutes that, etc. So it's like this internal dialogue that's also presented in here, which I think that's why it's maybe weird, like someone and someone else again, and then a third person, you never know who they are. But I think it's a beautiful way to reflect, first of all, this exchange with actual other people, but also this dialogue between our different states of mind, influenced by afflictions or wisdom, etc. Anyway, so here again, looking at the text, in response to the explanation given in verse 4, someone might argue, what is the point of examining whether or not conditions have or are of the same nature as the action of arising of their results? What is the point of this, right? So you could extend on that a little bit. What is all this headache? In verse number 4, it went on and on about you have the action of arising always together with a condition. You can't have a condition without this action of arising. So what's the point of stressing this? So causes such as, for instance, a seed, water, warmth, etc., they do not necessarily coincide with the arising of their result, the sprout. That's what someone argues. So instead, it's not that whenever you have a cause, the result is arising, someone would argue, because they say instead these causes are described as being the conditions of that sprout because the sprout arises in dependence on them. Right? So the argument is, there are actually some philosophers who would say, well, with every condition, the cause, the result is arising. No, that's not happening. It doesn't arise all the time. So we call it, we don't say it arises in every moment of the cause. We say instead that because of this cause, because of it, there will be a result. Therefore, we call it a cause, right? Because it produces the result. Therefore, we say it's a cause. And that's it. The result doesn't need to arise all the time. That's their argument. So instead, they're described. So a cause is a condition of a sprout, for instance, because the sprout arises in dependence on the sprout, the seed, etc., which is why they're considered to inherently have the nature of conditions. This is what someone argues. Okay. All right. Bhava Viveka, he explains in his commentary on the fundamental wisdom, the lamp of wisdom. I looked it up. Yes, it really says in Bhava Viveka's fundamental wisdom. I don't know whether this text has been translated into English. I don't think so, but it's been translated into Tibetan. So anyway, Bhava Viveka says that this argument reflects the view of the Satantrika. Okay, so the Satantrika, very important Buddhist school. It's one of the lowest schools in terms of selflessness, but we say lower school only in terms of their presentation of emptiness, but not lower in terms of their explanation of the mind, the explanation of cause and effect. I mean, a lot of the texts we study, they give us a very good sense of cause and effect, etc., are based on the Satantrika school. So it's incredibly valuable. Their literature is very valuable. But anyway, this view that was described up here that I just read through, that is a view of the Satantrika. The Buddhist school of the Satantrika maintains that conditions facilitate the action of arising only when their results are about to occur, not before that time. So, well, it's going to be explained. So not before that time. They don't say when you have all these causes, like, I don't know, the seed is there, acts as a cause of its result for, I don't know, a few hours or a few days. They say, no, at that time, it's the cause of the sprout, but the sprout is not arising. It's only shortly before the result is about to occur, it's about to come into existence, only shortly before that the cause arises. Kind of makes sense, doesn't it? Kind of makes sense. Okay. Thus, a result such as a sprout does not arise until shortly before its existence, when all of its causes and conditions have come together and are acting as its direct conditions. But not just that, direct conditions without being hindered by adverse factors that might prevent the sprout from coming into existence. Now, there's a term in Tibetan. I didn't mention it here. I thought it becomes too technical. And you don't hear this term in the English literature. Maybe every now and then, but no, I haven't really come across it. I don't even know what it's called. I would translate it as a direct cause that has an unimpeded potential. Muikyu nupa tome. Muikyu means direct cause, nupa means potential, and tome means unobstructed, unimpeded. Okay, that's the technical term. That refers to a cause of something. Okay, I'll show you the drawing that's easiest. Just a second. Okay, so let's say you have these moments of a seed in a pot. Let's say each moment is an hour. Okay, I mean, these moments, a moment can be as long as, I don't know, any period of time. I mean, any period of time can be described as a moment. So therefore, when you analyze it, you get a little bit into trouble, like how short is that short moment, etc. So, but anyway, without going into all these discussions anyway, things start to disappear when we go into deeper discussions on that. But the point is here, let's just say this moment is an hour long. Okay, let's determine this length of time. Although here becomes a little difficult, but let's say an hour. Okay, it's debatable, but anyway. So during these 4 hours, okay, so these are the indirect causes of the sprout. I'll talk about the indirect cause in a moment, but they're not directly giving rise to the sprout. So they're the indirect causes or conditions. At that time, although the seed, this is how tantrika, so the seed produces the sprout. Why does it produce the sprout? Well, by definition, because a cause is that which produces its result. By definition, it's that which produces. That's the name. That is the definition of a cause. It produces. Now, maybe some would argue, well, yeah, it produces something. It just doesn't produce the sprout. But in general, it is accepted that these are, well, they're the indirect causes of the sprout, so they better be the causes of the sprout. And if they're the causes of the sprout, they produce the sprout. Okay, so that's generally accepted. But the sprout doesn't arise at that time. It doesn't arise at the time of its indirect conditions, even though the conditions produce the sprout at that time. So when does the Sautrantika say the cause actually produces the sprout? Well, when all the causes, the most important causes and conditions have come together. At that time, they obviously haven't come together yet, because a moment later, there is no sprout yet. Okay, so something is still missing. The more important causes and conditions, yes, they are there, but they're not all there. So once they're all there, well, then a moment later, of course, the sprout can arise. That makes perfect sense, right? It's all ready. The seed, the water, the fertilizer, all this is just right for the sprout to arise. And that moment, that direct condition, is described as a condition that has an unimpeded potential. Okay. In other words, without using that kind of awkward term, it's a direct condition when adverse factors can no longer prevent the sprout from arising. And throughout our years of study, this is what we learned. We're very, very familiar with this as part of studying the different traditions. I mean, even although this is definitely a view coming from the Sautantrikas, but it's accepted also by the other schools. Why? Well, basically, there's a sense it's inherent in a cause to give rise to its result. There's no talk about the cause being dependent on the result. The cause is dependent on the result. No, because phenomena are not merely labeled. In the lower schools, I'm talking strictly about the lower schools, the result depends on the cause. The lower schools say, yes, the result depends on the cause, because without that inherent cause preceding it, you couldn't have a result. That is what the lower schools would say. And that's how we ordinarily feel about cause and effect. This is our sense of cause and effect. Yes, there's something within the cause that makes it a cause, something within the seed. There's some potential, something inherent in that seed. And that then allows for the seed to become, when all the conditions come together, that also have a potential to activate that potential in the seed. So when they all come together to give rise to the sprout. So the cause is not dependent on the sprout, because you can have a cause without the sprout, right? You can have a cause, let's say at that time here, you have here this cause, but something happens, a bird eats the seed, and you never have a sprout. Therefore, this does not depend, this seed does not depend on the sprout. Why would it? Its existence does not depend on its result. The Prasangika would disagree, because they say this being a cause very much depends on the result. But the lower schools don't talk like that. They don't talk about labeling in that way, right? So quite different. And the lower schools reflect actually much more our own way of thinking, although that's of course not in accordance with reality. It's a result of the way phenomena appear to us. But in order to understand that, it's of course very helpful to understand the lower schools. But anyway, it all makes sense. It all makes sense what they say, the lower schools. Therefore, not only is the cause not dependent on the result, no, because it exists perfectly without the result being there, whereas the result could never exist unless there was a cause. So that's the argument in the lower school. That is their argument in the lower schools for saying the result is dependent on the cause, but the cause is not dependent on the result. Okay. Now, having said this, it kind of also makes sense, and I mean, maybe also because I'm so used to think along these lines, that why would the sprout be arising at that time? No, not everything is there yet. It could be disrupted by a bird picking the seed, for instance, or there's still certain conditions, still something must be missing, because otherwise a moment later the sprout would arise, but it doesn't. So we have to wait until this moment and all the conditions, everything is there. All the conditions, the nitty-gritty little conditions, even the major conditions are here, but still something is missing because otherwise the sprout would arise a moment later. No, there's still something missing, but here at that time has come together. And there is a moment when nothing can prevent the sprout from arising, and that is the time when it arises. That's the Sautrantika view. And like I said, it makes sense. I mean, like, I'm so used to it for years. I've heard this time and again. Okay. Anyway, so that's the Sautrantika view. And so they're saying, why do you go on and on about? If at that time the sprout is not arising, then everything that was said in verse number 4, you can't have a condition without arising. No, that's then not true, right? That's how they would argue. I left this really long footnote here. I thought maybe it's helpful when they talk about a direct or indirect cause. It's not really that difficult, but it's an important concept. It comes up a lot, and I thought I'd just briefly explain it, just to go back to, well, here you have the indirect condition. Why is that an indirect condition? Why is that a direct condition? It won't take long. I'll just briefly read through it. That every cause can be divided. There are different categories of causes. We've already heard the 4 conditions, the 6 causes, but since they're very complicated and sophisticated and there's so much to it, they have so many features, there's a further division. They can be classified into direct and indirect causes. Direct causes produce their results directly in the sense that the moment a direct cause has ceased, so the moment it has ceased or gone out of existence, a direct result will have arisen or come into existence. So the direct cause, the moment it's gone, the effect is there. Okay, so it's a bit like the moment after your death, the moment later there is the pardo. Okay, after your death. So the direct cause of the first moment of the pardo is death, is the separation of our consciousness and our body in this life. Because a moment later, when that has happened, a moment later, the pardo is there. There's nothing in between. Therefore, our death is the direct cause of the first moment of our pardo. Taking that example, which is a little bit more complicated, here I chose smoke and fire. Okay, so fire. So we haven't really spoken about fire and smoke, but it's also a really important example of cause and effect. It's simple, but still used a lot. Of course, in terms of smoke serving as an indication or reason for the existence of fire, which in everyday life we use this example actually, and Buddhism is used a lot as well. But besides that, let's take here this example of fire. Fire, which directly gives rise to its result, smoke. So there's a moment of fire, and when that moment is gone, the moment later you have smoke. So that's an example of a direct cause. Fire directly produces smoke because the moment fire has ceased to exist, so it's a moment of fire, a certain moment in time, has ceased to exist, it marks the moment smoke has come into existence. There's no other phenomenon that exists after the fire has ceased and before smoke has arisen. Okay, not that hard to understand. Firewood, on the other hand, is an indirect cause of smoke. So first you have firewood, then you have fire, and then you have smoke, right? Firewood, fire, smoke. Of course, firewood, burning firewood, and then smoke. Here we're talking about firewood in the sense of giving rise to the fire. So firewood, on the other hand, is an indirect cause of smoke, for it indirectly gives rise to the smoke. This means that the two, firewood having ceased and smoke having arisen, do not occur simultaneously. So, sorry for this nitty-gritty explanation, but this is how it's put in the text usually. So firewood having ceased and smoke having arisen do not occur simultaneously. For fire exists after the firewood has ceased and before smoke has arisen. Okay, so fire exists after the firewood has ceased and before smoke. Hence, firewood is the direct cause of fire and the indirect cause of smoke. Okay, so firewood gives rise to fire, fire gives rise to smoke. Therefore, between the smoke and the fire, between the firewood and the smoke, there's fire, which is why firewood is only the indirect cause. Okay, not that hard to understand, but it's important to use the terminology right. When we debate it, when we study about this, we hear indirect cause right away. We know what it refers to. So in order not to explain it again, I put this little footnote here. Similarly, if a sprout is preceded by 5 moments of a seed, then the first 4 moments of the seed are the indirect causes of the sprout, right? There, indirect causes of the sprout. I use the same example. While the 5th moment of the seed is the direct cause. This is because the moment when the 5th moment of the seed has ceased is the moment when the sprout has come into existence. There's no other phenomenon that exists after the 5th moment of the seed, after the 5th moment of the seed has ceased and before the sprout has come into existence. The first 4 moments of the seed, on the other hand, give rise to the sprout only indirectly, because the moment when they have ceased does not mark the moment when the sprout has arisen. However, the first moment of the seed is the direct cause of the second moment of the seed. The second moment of the seed is the direct cause of the third moment of the seed, and so on. So it's again relativity. Okay, is this a direct cause? Is it an indirect cause? Well, inherently, it's neither. It's not a direct cause, it's not an indirect cause, but it's a direct cause in relation to the next moment. And it's an indirect cause in relation to this and this and this and this moment, right? So in other words, the first moment of the seed, in and of itself, is it a direct cause? Is it an indirect cause? It's neither. Nothing. Nada. Nothing. But in relation to the second moment of the seed, the third moment of the seed, the fourth moment, the fifth moment. No, sorry, I have to say it again. No, again. This first moment of the seed in relation to the third moment of the seed, the fourth moment, the fifth moment, and the sprout, it's an indirect cause. And in relation to the second moment of the seed, it's a direct cause. Okay. In relation to its cause, to what preceded it, it's also a result. Okay. All right. Anyway. Okay. So I hope this is clear. Now, it's always in relation to, of course, other objects without which it couldn't exist anyway, or that which is dependent on. We can say it is a direct cause, an indirect cause, etc. Anyway, I just wanted to explain this to you. Oh, yes. Okay. All right. And one more footnote I forgot to mention, because I've said the Satantrikas have this view. Well, to give you some source that supports that, I haven't always given you sources, but in that moment I remember to give you a source. So that the Satantrika hold this view, this is supported by the Abhidharma Kosha, which you may remember, I don't know whether I've said it, but you may have heard about this, doesn't just present the Vaibhashika view, it also presents the Satantrika view. It actually mainly presents the Satantrika view by way of refuting the Vaibhashika view. So the Abhidharma Kosha, that you probably all heard of, by Vasubandhu, it describes the Satantrika view and says, well, the Vaibhashika view is such and such, so that's wrong. So in that way, you learn both. You learn about the Vaibhashika and you learn about the Sautrantrika. Okay. Anyway, so this is a great source for both views. Usually it's used mainly for the view of the Vaibhashika because there are other texts that you learn about the Sautrantrika, but both are actually set forth, especially the Sautrantrika following scripture. Anyway, for example, in the second chapter of his commentary on the Treasury of Knowledge, the Abhidhamma Kosha, entitled Clarifying the Path to Liberation. So the commentary was by the first Dalai Lama, Gyalwa Gendun Drup. It's called Clarifying the Path to Liberation. It's a text we usually study, or you study as part of the Geshe studies. So in the second chapter on this commentary, Treasury of Knowledge, the first Dalai Lama, Gyalwa Gendun Drup, gives the following explanation that is in accordance with the Sautrantrika school. Arising occurs immediately before the result, when all the causes have come together, because at that time, there's nothing that can act to prevent the result from arising. Now, these brackets, they imply that although these words are not literally in the text, but they're strongly implied. In Tibetan, it's immediately obvious that this is what this means. In English, they have to be added. So this is a source for the Sautrantrika saying, we believe arising only happens then. Okay, so this is the source. And like I said, when we studied this, when we studied philosophy, this was the way we studied it. And it's not very much, you see, this text, the fundamental wisdom, is not studied in the same way as, for instance, supplement to the middle way, or entering the middle way by Chandakirti. Chandakirti is part of the is part of the syllogism, as in like, not syllogism, sorry, syllabus. The syllabus of study. So the topics that you study, well, one of the texts on Uma, the main text, is Chandakirti's Entering the Middle Way, which is a commentary on the fundamental wisdom. Fundamental wisdom is not studied as part of the main curriculum. Oh, that was the word I was looking for. It's not studied as part of the main curriculum, which I think is a shame. That's why I'm going through it, though it's really challenging for me as well. I did study it privately, but not to the extent as I studied the Entering the Middle Way. And Lama Tsongkhapa's commentary is really challenging, but so extensive and so amazing. So, but it's really interesting that what is described now in verse number 5, I have a teacher from Drepung, who's an amazing teacher, who has a lot of students down there. He was surprised by this. He said he's not really sure this can be right, but we went through it again and again. We discussed it for a few hours, well, on the phone, but still. And in the end, he said, yes, well, Lama Tsongkhapa is very clear on this. It's quite different to this view. It's quite different to this view. So this is discussed usually in the context of the Sautrantrika, not so much in the context of the Madhyamika. But it's just assumed that the Madhyamika asserts this. But here it becomes very obvious that, at least according to the fundamental wisdom, and in particular what Lama Tsongkhapa says, that this is not right. This is not right. So it's really interesting. I haven't had the time to talk to many of my teachers about this yet, but I will eventually, to get their view on this. But I researched this again and again, and yeah, it doesn't seem to be contradicted by other literature. Anyway, all right, so let's look at this. So what does the Prasangika say? And here the fundamental wisdom, this is J. Garfield's translation. Then here's an alternative translation that is more based on how I understand this verse. So either you read it, since in dependence on these, there's arising. These are called conditions. As long as those do not arise, why are there not non-conditions? Alternatively, because something arises in dependence on them, the conditions, they are declared to be conditions. As long as the thing does not arise, how can there not be its non-conditions? Okay, so What does this mean? What does this verse mean? In response to this Sautrantika assertion, Nagarjuna says that impermanent phenomena are declared. Declared here is a term in Tibetan. It's not necessary, doesn't necessarily imply in Tibetan that Nagarjuna doesn't agree, but from the context it becomes clear. So Nagarjuna says that impermanent phenomena are declared by philosophers such as the Sautrantikas to be the conditions of something only because that thing arises in dependence on the phenomena. Okay, it's not saying that it arises in each moment of that condition, but in general, it arises in dependence on that. But Nagarjuna argues, if that is your view, as described here, yes, so what would the Sautrantikas say? That this sprout arises in dependence on the first moment of the seed. But it doesn't mean, so it arises in dependence on that, but it doesn't mean that the rising takes place in that moment, right? So the sprout, yes, you didn't have the first moment, if you didn't have the first moment of the seed, in other words, the Sautrantika would say, if you didn't have the first moment of the seed, which gives rise to the second, the third, the fourth, and the fifth moment, well, then you couldn't have the sprout. Therefore, it depends on the sprout. Yes, it does, but that doesn't mean it arises at the time of the first moment of the sprout, right? So this sprout depends on the first moment of the seed. Sorry, I get confused with the words. This sprout depends on the first moment of the seed, but it doesn't mean that it arises in that moment. That's what the Sautrantika says. And Nagarjuna disagrees. He says, no, saying that the first moment of the seed is the cause of the sprout only because the sprout depends on it, or it arises in dependence on this, that is not enough. Because as long as the thing such as the sprout, such as the seed, the sprout. But as long as the sprout, does not arise at the time of its indirect conditions, indirect conditions, how can these indirect conditions be its conditions? Would they not in fact be its non-conditions? Nagarjuna argues, right? As long as the thing does not arise during these conditions, how can they not be its non-conditions? Why would you call them causes if nothing happens from the side of the result? Here, the expression are declared, okay, are declared or are called. But called, yeah, I wouldn't translate it as called, are known or declared or known, renowned. That's what the Tibetan word really implies. But anyway, so the expression are declared indicates that Nagarjuna disagrees with the view of the Sautrantikas, for he holds that a result must arise at the time of both its direct and indirect conditions. Thus, it is not sufficient to describe a condition simply as that independence upon which a result arises. Okay. Now, the challenge is to figure out why the Prasangika asserts that and the other schools don't. We say Sautrantikas, but I haven't come across any of the other schools who would disagree with the Sautrantikas on that point here, right? So the Prasangika asserting that, what do they assert? What is the root assertion when it comes to cause and effect in the Prasangika school? First of all, of course, cause and effect don't exist inherently. Yes. But also, not only does the result or the effect depend on the cause, but the cause also depends on the effect or the result. So that mutual dependence is unique to the Prasangika school. It's unique to the Prasangika school. And they say, based on that assertion, how could it be otherwise? Based on that assertion that cause and effect are mutually dependent. So this mutual dependence you don't find in the same way in the other schools. mutual dependence. Very, very important. Of course, the other schools would say hot is dependent on cold and cold is dependent on hot. Yes. That level of relativity here is dependent on there and there is dependent on here, but not when it comes to causes and conditions. And cause and effect. And I gave you the reason before. Remember, the existence of the cause does not depend on the result, because the result comes only in the future. So even if the result never happens because there's some obstacle, whatever, in the case of the seed and the sprout, a bird eats the seed. Oh my God, did we debate this? And as part of the study of Pramana-Vatika, a bird eats the seed. There's a whole topic on causes and conditions. Anyway, never mind, I'm not going to go into that. But yes, so there's a lot of debate on, there's an obstacle to the arisal of the sprout. So is it still a condition or not? Anyway, it's part of the understanding of causes and conditions that we debated this. But the point being, okay, so therefore here in this context, the question is, with regard to the last moment, so with regard to the Sautrantika view that a result depends on a cause, but a cause doesn't depend on a result, because even if the result never happens, the cause can still exist. So that is their view. Whereas the Prasangika school would say, yes, we agree with that. We agree with this. Yes, that's true. However, on top of that, a cause is only a cause if there is a result, right? Yes.
So,
sorry.
On this view for Prasangika, so I'm just thinking like of a tomato seed. We know that a tomato seed produces tomatoes. So let's say I have a tomato seed and for some reason there's no water and my tomato seed doesn't produce a tomato, but I still feel that it is the cause of a tomato. You know, that the seed is not dependent on the tomato. Like I agree with the Sautrantika view in the sense that, you know, even though my tomato seed, for whatever reason, you know, didn't produce the tomato, I know that tomato seeds produce tomatoes. Just in this case, for whatever reason, the tomato didn't arise.
Yes, I agree with this, because yes, exactly, this sense of inherent existence. There's something in the tomato, there's something in the tomato that gives rise to tomato seed that gives rise to the tomato itself. So therefore, yes, there's something inherent in it, but the tomato seed is not dependent on the tomato. So, right? I mean, I feel exactly the same way. The Prasangika would say the tomato seed is a seed, yes, but it's also a cause. Its identity of a cause is inseparable from it being a tomato seed, right? A tomato seed and a tomato seed being a cause, these are features that are inseparable. One couldn't exist without the other. So whatever the tomato seed being a cause is dependent on, the tomato seed itself has to depend on, right? Now, the tomato seed being a cause is only a cause in dependence on a result, whether that result happens or not. But in terms of labeling it a cause, right? There must be a potential result. In that sense, for instance, to give you another example, my cousin, okay, so having a cousin. So whether that cousin exists now or not is not the point, but it's in relation to a cousin that I'm a cousin. My cousinness, or no, I wouldn't call it cousinness because that implies inherent existence. But me thinking of myself as a cousin or as a sibling requires another person. It's in relation to this other person that I call myself a sibling. I call myself a sister. I label sister, and therefore I become a sister, independent on the other person. Beyond that, is there any sisterness to be found? No. If this other person had never existed, I would not be a sister, right? If there were never a brother or sister, okay. If that had never arisen. Now, here with regard to the result, okay, because that lies in the future. That's slightly different. That's a little bit more difficult because there is in Tibetan they would say whether the future happens or not, there's doubt. We don't know whether that's going to happen or not. With the sister, it's like, well, there must be a time when they exist together. This is why cause and effect are a little bit more difficult. But still, we talk about a potential result, even though it never arises. But if none of these obstacles had occurred, say a bird eating the seed or the tomato seed in that case, so or a mouse or whatever, without their having eaten it, it would have arisen. And so we speak of it as a cause in relation to what could have potentially happened. Why else would I call it a cause? Why would it be a cause? It's merely labeled. And in relation to that, that takes me to why they would also say, the Prasangika school would also say that with each moment, this sprout is arising, not just in that moment, because we label independence on the sprout producing, sorry, the seed, the tomato seed producing the sprout, and there's no doubt on that. It's producing it, right? It's the indirect cause of the tomato. That's the tomato sprout. Let's say that's the tomato sprout. Doesn't look like a tomato seed, but never mind. So that first moment of the tomato seed, right? That first moment of the tomato seed is how hard to say tomato seed. So that first moment of the tomatoes, that is the indirect cause of the sprout, and therefore it's producing it. As an indirect cause is defined as that which produces, so it produces it. But producing something, when we label produce something, we can also label something is arising. You need two hands to clap. If there's no producing, there must also be a arising. If it's merely labeled, then it's okay to label it as arising. If it's okay to label arising here, when there's no sprout yet, we still label arising in that moment. Well, if it arises then, it's also arising here because producing takes place, right? So we move away from the sense there's something within it. There's something, we have to move away from it. We have to recognize it within us. So great, what you just did. You feel it makes perfectly sense what the Sautrantika says, for instance, cause and effect not being mutually dependent. But also, if you studied this long enough, the sense of, yeah, now it can actually, the Sautrantika is saying, now it can actually arise because nothing is going to be in its way. Well, who cares something is in its way or not? Since it's being produced during the first 4 moments, why is it not arising then? Right? So,
sorry,
yes,
do you
please
want to
study.
do for us the meditation now?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. Is that
So
okay?
we continue with B next week. B, can you
B had a
write
question.
me and I will send it?
Oh, yes, B, please. Where's B? I can't see her. B, if you don't mind, if you could, yeah, send in your question. Oh, there you are. Yes.
I didn't send in a question.
Oh, you didn't?
No, we
Oh,
ask you if you can send the question that you ask now in the lesson, if you can send it to me, and we will talk about it next week. Continue talking about it next week.
okay. Okay, great. Anyway, for anyone who has a question, you're welcome to ask. So let's do a short meditation on this. All right, we start, as always, we start with some breathing meditation. To just let go of any disruptive thoughts, settle the mind. So what we learned today is that according to the lower schools, whose assertions, of course, based on inherent existence, accord with many of our views simply because of everything appearing to us to exist inherently. So, for instance, the view that a result, such as a sprout, depends for its existence on its seed. But the seed does not depend on the sprout. Can you get a sense how Satrantika or the other lower schools are right about that? Also, they believe that a sprout only arises shortly before it has come into existence. When all the causes and conditions have assembled, and there's nothing that can prevent the production of the sprout. The Prasangika school disagrees. Since the seed is inseparable from its feature as a cause of the sprout, that which the seed depends on, or that which the seed as a cause depends on, the seed has to depend on as well. In other words, if the seed that is a cause depends on its result, then that seed has to depend on its result. Because its identity as a cause is merely labeled in dependence on a potential result. That is a result that may or may not at some point exist. Therefore, the Prasangika school agrees with the lower schools that the existence of a result depends on a cause preceding it. But they go further than that. The Prasangika school also says that a result is labeled a result in dependence on its cause and a cause is labeled as such in dependence on its result. So just as long and short are mutually dependent, Prasangika school says cause and result are mutually dependent as well. And it is that mutual dependence a mother being a mother only in dependence on the child a child being dependent on the mother. Here being dependent on there, and there being dependent on here. that accounts for the fact that when you have the producing of a result, you must have the arising of the result. Which accounts for the fact that even the first moment of these 5 moments of a seed coincides with the arising of the sprout. Or it's inseparably linked with the arising of the result, because it produces the result. And producing a result and arising of the result are mutually dependent. So now to conclude this analysis, take a moment to single-pointedly focus on whatever insight you've gained. And allow for it to sink deeper. To reach a subtle level of your understanding. And let's dedicate all the positive potential we've accumulated today together studying and meditating about fundamental wisdom. Let's dedicate it well towards, of course, our own enlightenment for the welfare of each and every sentient being. May we quickly attain the state of a Buddha. And in the meantime, may this positive potential cause our great lamas, like His Holiness the Dalai Lama and all the other realized beings, to have a long and healthy life and continue to guide us through their teachings and their example. And of course, may all those suffering physically, like Geshe Punso, Tali Lubin, and everyone else being ill, and those suffering mentally, of course, very soon recover from their problems, their sufferings. But in particular today being the 9th, the 11th of September, 9/11, may our virtue also affect all the victims of violent actions. May it help those victims, those family members affected by their death, to quickly overcome their grief. And may those who cause acts of violence generate more compassion and wisdom in their minds to understand that these can never solve a problem. So based on that, let's recite the prayers together. Through the merits of these virtuous actions, may I quickly attain the state of a Guru Buddha and lead all living beings without exception into that enlightened state. In the land encircled by snow mountains, you are the source of all happiness and good. All-powerful Chinrezig, Tenzin Gyatso, please remain until samsara ends. May the precious Bodhi mind, not yet born, arise and grow. May that born have no decline, but increase forevermore. Okay, thank you very much. And if you have any questions, please send them to Dalit. If you don't want to write them down, you can also maybe leave a voice message with her, and then she can send it on to me, whichever is easiest. Thank you. And see you again next
Thank
time. Bye.
Thank you, Dalit.
Bye.
Jennifer.
Thank you,
Thank you,
Dalit.
Dalit.
Bye-bye.
Good night.
Thank you, Geshe.
Bye-bye.
Thanks for your message, Gila.
דלית? רק ככה לציין, היום זה גם 50 שנה להפיכה צבאית בצ'ילה. אפרופו דברים קשים.
כן, וגם המתים במרוקו, בארסקווייק.
כן, זה המשך של הימים הקודמים, אבל כיום ציון, כזה, כשגשמה הזכירה את התאומים, זה גם היום של שפינוצ'ה עלה לשלטון.
וואו.
ולתוצאות הלא טובות שהיה לזה.
כן.
ומין דוגמה להשלכה אולי למה שמחכה לנו.
טפו טפו.
טפו טפו, כן. קצת מסורת
חס
לוקחת, זה
וחלילה,
טוב.
חס וחלילה, חס וחלילה.
בדיוק.
כן, כן.
אנשים רבים עולים היום לירושלים.
כן. כמו שאמרתם, טפו טפו, יש בסרט הזה שבטח כולכם ראיתם, של הדלאי למה עם דסמונד טוטו, איזשהו רגע מכונן, אני חושב בשבילי היה, כשהדלאי למה אומר, in Buddhism, no superstition, maybe a little. אז פו פו.
לא קולוד. ביי ביי.
ביי, תודה, להתראות.
ביי. שנה טובה.